Welcome to this exploration of one of the most disturbing cases ever documented in American history. Before we start, I'd like to ask you to share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you're hearing this narration. We're curious to know how far these recorded accounts travel and at what hours of the day or night they reach their audience. In the fall of 1837, the St. Louis Hotel in New Orleans was filled with the city's wealthiest men. The auction that evening had drawn an unusual amount of attention, even for a town known as the largest slave market in the United States. What set this particular sale apart was not the number of people on the block, but the presence of a single woman who would soon become known across the city as the Pearl. A name that would reverberate through the French Quarter's cobblestone streets for decades. She stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, with skin described in the auction papers as the color of fresh cream, touched by the faintest hint of coffee. Her deep amber eyes seemed to shift hue depending on the light, and her long, glossy black hair fell in waves down her back. The auctioneer, Thomas Williams, introduced her simply as lot number 17. But those present knew they were witnessing something remarkable. As murmurs moved through the crowd like ripples on the Mississippi, bidding began at an astonishing sum, 5 times the price of an ordinary house servant. What followed would become one of the strangest chapters in New Orleans history, a city already notorious for its complex racial hierarchy and the brutal economics of human bondage. It would connect powerful families, uncover long-buried secrets, and eventually lead to a series of disappearances that remained unsolved until 1962, when a renovation project at the old Delacroix mansion on Royal Street revealed a hidden room containing a leather-bound journal, 3 human finger bones, and a portrait of a woman whose beauty, even captured in aging paint, seemed almost otherworldly. This is the story of Ella Reynolds, known to most as the Pearl, and the terrifying truth behind her disappearance in the winter of 1842. The auction that night in 1837 was recorded by multiple witnesses, including James Thornton, a northern businessman in New Orleans to establish cotton trade connections. In his personal diary, recovered from his Boston estate in 1952, Thornton described the scene with clear discomfort. He had never witnessed such frenzy among gentlemen of standing as occurred that night at the Hotel Exchange. The woman for sale was indeed striking in appearance, yet the behavior of those present seemed driven by something beyond mere desire for human property. There was an almost religious fervor in their bidding, as if acquiring this particular slave held significance beyond the material world. What Thornton couldn't have known was the complex web of history surrounding the woman on the block. Ella Reynolds had not been born into slavery, nor had she arrived through the usual channels of the domestic slave trade. According to ship records from the port of New Orleans, she had come just 3 weeks earlier on a vessel called the Augusta, listed not as cargo but as a passenger accompanying a merchant named Marcus Bennett. But by the time the Augusta docked, Bennett was dead, supposedly from a fever contracted in Havana during their voyage. With no free papers found among Bennett's possessions, Eleanor was seized by port authorities and eventually placed for auction. This much was public record. What wasn't known until the discovery of the Delacroix journal was why a woman of such obvious refinement and education had ended up in these circumstances, and why certain families in New Orleans had taken such extraordinary interest in ensuring she would never leave the city. Before we go deeper into the events of that winter, we must understand the New Orleans of 1837. The city was then a complex mosaic of cultures, economies, and racial classifications, more elaborate than anywhere else in America. Following the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, The city had transformed from a French and Spanish colonial outpost into a booming American port where fortunes were made in cotton, sugar, and human beings. New Orleans had developed a three-tiered racial system unlike the strict black-white division found elsewhere in the South. Between these categories existed the gens de couleur libres, free people of color, many of whom were wealthy property owners and sometimes slaveholders themselves. It was a city of contradictions. Brutal slave markets operated within walking distance of opera houses. Codes noirs regulated the treatment of slaves, while sophisticated social events called quadroon balls facilitated arrangements between white men and free women of color. Above all, it was a place where appearance and bloodlines carried immense social and legal weight. The difference between freedom and bondage could hinge on a single ancestor, a fact that would prove central to Ella Lenina, Reynolds's story. The winning bid that night came from Charles Delacroix, a wealthy sugar planter whose family had been in Louisiana since the early French colonial period. Delacroix paid the unprecedented sum of $70,000, enough to purchase an entire plantation of field workers, for a woman who, by all accounts, had no experience with domestic service or field labor. The transaction was recorded by notary William Patterson, whose ledger noted something unusual. Delacroix insisted the bill of sale describe Ella Lenina not as a slave, but as a ward to be housed in his Royal Street residence. What happened after Ella Lenina was taken to the Delacroix home remains unclear due to conflicting accounts. Household staff interviewed decades later by a journalist from the Daily Picayune recalled that she was treated not as a servant, but as a guest, given a private room in the family quarters, and provided with clothing befitting a society woman. Yet she was never seen leaving the property, and visitors to the house reported that Delacroix introduced her as his distant cousin from France, who spoke little English. According to household records, Delacroix's wife, Isabelle, left for her family home in Natchez just 2 weeks after Ella Lenina's arrival, taking their 3 children with her. She would not return for nearly 6 months. During this period, Charles Delacroix closed his Royal Street house to all visitors and conducted his business entirely through written correspondence delivered by his private secretary. The mystery deepened when in January 1838, Dr. Samuel Lawrence was summoned to the Delacroix home to attend to Ella Lenina, who was reportedly suffering from a persistent cough. Dr. Lawrence's medical journal, preserved in the archives of Tulane University, contained an entry noting that he was called to attend to a young woman at the Delacroix residence. The patient exhibited symptoms consistent with consumption, though her overall constitution appeared sound. What troubled him more was the evident distress in her manner. When alone, she asked if he knew of her true circumstances before her arrival in New Orleans. Before he could respond, Delacroix returned to the room, and she spoke no further on the matter. Dr. Lawrence noted that he prescribed standard bed rest and tonics, but also recorded his impression that the lady's ailment seemed as much of the spirit as of the body. He was never called back to the house. By spring of that year, rumors had begun circulating through New Orleans society about the mysterious beauty of the Delacroix mansion. Some claimed she was Charles Delacroix's illegitimate daughter, others that she was his mistress brought from abroad. The most persistent rumor, however, was that she was somehow connected to the Villers family, one of the oldest and most secretive lineages in Louisiana, whose patriarch, Henry Villers, had been among the most aggressive bidders at the auction before Delacroix's winning offer.